The cold morning. The first thing they found was the coffee. It was in a metal camping mug, sitting on the edge of a small, foldable table. It was cold, a dark, bitter film having formed on its surface. Next to it, a half-eaten protein bar lay on its wrapper, looking as though its owner had been interrupted mid-bite. A pair of worn leather slippers sat neatly by the leg of the camping chair, placed as if someone had just slipped them off to pull on their hiking boots. The tent flap was zipped open just enough for a person to pass through, and inside, a sleeping bag was unrolled but otherwise undisturbed. Everything was in its place. Everything except for the man himself, Benjamin Carter. He had been reported missing 24 hours after he was due to check out of his reserved spot at the base of Mount Cinder, a jagged peak in a remote region the old maps called North Hollow. The site manager, a gruff man named Hank who had seen his share of lost hikers, was the one who made the call. He'd noted the stillness of the camp, the untouched breakfast, the eerie silence where there should have been the rustle of packing up. But what truly unsettled him was the fog. It wasn't a normal morning mist that burned off with the sun. This was a thick, oppressive blanket of gray that had rolled down from the mountain's upper slope sometime before dawn. It clung to the trees, muffled every sound, and carried a strange, metallic chill. It was a predatory fog, one that seemed to swallow light and landscape with equal appetite. Hank had lived there for 40 years and had never seen anything quite like it. It was, he'd told the dispatcher, a suffocating kind of quiet. This was why they called Detective Alastair Reacher. Reacher was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was tall, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains he now investigated. He operated on a simple, unshakable principle: every effect has a cause, every mystery a solution grounded in the tangible world. Ghosts, curses, and things that go bump in the night were the domain of storytellers, not detectives. He dealt in evidence, timelines, and the predictable, often disappointing, failings of human nature. As he surveyed Ben Carter's campsite, his mind was already building a logical framework. Runaway? Possible, but why leave his wallet and car keys in the tent? Animal attack? Unlikely. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. The scene was unervingly pristine. Foul play? Again, the lack of any struggle was a powerful counterargument. It was as if the man had simply stepped out for a moment and been erased from existence. Sheriff Brody, a local with a kind face and eyes that held the long memory of the town, stood beside Reacher, arms crossed over his ample chest. "The mountain took him," Brody said, his voice low and devoid of irony. "It happens. Always has." Reacher picked up the cold mug of coffee, swirling the dark liquid. "The mountain is a geological formation, Sheriff. It doesn't take people. People get lost, they fall, or they are taken by other people. This place is different, Detective," Brody insisted, gesturing with his chin towards the fog-shrouded peak. "North Hollow, it's got a history. The pioneers who settled here, the ones who survived, they wrote about it. They called the fog the Gray Shroud. Wrote about lights in the woods, voices that whispered their names on the wind, trees that weren't where they were the day before." Reacher set the mug down with a soft click. He'd read the preliminary file. He knew the local folklore. Legends dating back to the first quiet, Protestant settlements that tried to tame this land. Tales of a place that accepted people into its embrace but was reluctant to let them go. He dismissed it as the superstitious ramblings of isolated people trying to explain the unexplainable hardships of frontier life. He was a man of facts, and the facts here were maddeningly absent. He spent the next 2 days conducting a meticulous, grid-by-grid search. He interviewed other campers, analyzed timings, and mapped out Ben Carter's known movements. Carter was a travel blogger, an experienced outdoorsman. His last post was a photo of the sunrise from his campsite, time-stamped 5:42 a.m. The caption read, "The fog is rolling in. Something feels different about this place. Ancient." After that, silence. The search turned up nothing. No footprints leading away from the camp, the damp earth seemed to have swallowed them. No broken branches, no discarded items. The dogs brought in for the search became agitated and whined, refusing to go more than 100 yards into the tree line where the fog was thickest. Then, on the third day, it happened again. A young couple, hiking on a lower trail, had stopped to take a picture. The woman, her name was Maya, was framing a shot of her boyfriend, Leo, with the misty woods behind him. He was about 50 feet away, standing near a ridge that overlooked a deep ravine. The fog was rolling in and out, playing tricks with the light. She told Reacher later, her voice trembling in the sterile environment of the sheriff's office, what she saw. He was just standing there, she sobbed, clutching a paper cup of water. I told him to smile, but he didn't seem to hear me. He just turned his head, slowly, towards the deepest part of the fog. And the look on his face, detective. It was so empty. Like he wasn't awake, you know. Not asleep, but, not there. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at anything. Reacher leaned forward, his own eyes intense. What happened then, Maya? The fog, it got so thick, just for a second. Like a wall of smoke. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, he was gone. He was just gone. They found her camera lying on the trail. The last photo was time-stamped 9:17 a.m. It was blurry, distorted by the mist, but it showed the faint outline of a man standing at the edge of the ridge. And just as Maya had described, his head was turned away, looking into the impenetrable gray. There were no sounds, no screams, no signs of a fall into the ravine below. One moment he was there, a man with a future, a life, a love. The next, he was just another story for North Hollow. Reacher stood on that same ridge later that evening, the same unnatural fog coiling around his ankles. 2 men gone in 3 days. No bodies, no clues, no rational explanation. He stared into the swirling gray abyss, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. For the first time in his career, the logical framework he relied upon was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, the whispers of old, impossible stories were starting to seep in. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. It was the chill of a pattern beginning to emerge, a pattern that logic could not explain and that his instinct screamed was utterly, terrifyingly real. The miller's shadow. The town of Havenwood, nestled in the valley below Mount Cinder, was a place where history wasn't just remembered, it was a lingering presence. It was in the warped floorboards of the general store, in the faded paint of the church steeple, and in the quiet, watchful eyes of its older residents. For Reacher, it was now a library of whispers, and he needed to learn its language. The disappearances of Ben Carter and Leo Martinez had moved beyond the scope of a standard missing persons case. They were now entries in a ledger that stretched back centuries. His investigation led him to the town archives, a dusty, book-filled room in the back of the municipal building curated by a woman named Elara Vance. She was as much a fixture of the archives as the decaying paper she protected. With silver hair tied in a severe bun and eyes magnified by thick spectacles, she moved through the shelves with a silent reverence. She had heard Reacher was in town, and when he entered her sanctuary, she simply nodded and pointed to a large, leather-bound tome already laid out on a reading table. "You're looking for the wrong clues, detective," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "You won't find them on the mountain. The answers are in the echoes." Reacher ran a hand over the brittle cover of the book. It was a collection of town records and personal diaries from the 18th century. He spent hours poring over the spidery, faded ink of the first settlers. He found the entries Sheriff Brody had mentioned, descriptions of a malevolent fog and disembodied voices. But then he found something more, a recurring story that seemed to weave through the fabric of the town's darkest moments. It was the legend of Silas Kane, the windmill miller. According to the records, Silas Kane was an outsider, a man who arrived in the mid-1700s with knowledge of engineering and milling that was far beyond his contemporaries. He built a massive windmill on the eastern slope of Mount Cinder, a feat of construction that powered the burgeoning settlement. But Silas was a strange, solitary man. He kept to himself, spoke in odd cadences, and was said to practice unnatural arts. The townspeople respected his skill but feared his nature. The turning point came during a brutal winter when a sickness swept through the town. Accusations, fueled by fear and paranoia, turned towards the isolated figure on the mountain. They called him a sorcerer, blaming him for the blight. A mob, led by the town's fanatical preacher, marched up the mountain to the windmill. They didn't find Silas, but they found strange charts of the stars, intricate mechanical devices that served no apparent purpose, and writings in a language no one could identify. In their terror, they declared him a witch and set his mill ablaze. The story goes that a sudden, violent storm erupted as the windmill burned, a storm so localized and furious that it seemed to spring from the mountain itself. The flaming blades of the windmill were torn from the structure and sent spinning into the tempest. The last thing the mob saw was the silhouette of Silas Kane, standing on the ridge, his arms raised to the sky as the burning embers of his life's work swirled around him. He was never seen again, and neither was the wreckage of his windmill. It was as if the storm had scoured the mountain clean. But his curse, they wrote, remained. A curse upon the land, upon the path his windmill's shadow would have traced at sunrise. They called the lingering horror, the shadow of the windmill. People began to report hearing the creak and groan of the great wheel on foggy mornings, and seeing a fleeting, spinning shadow in the corner of their eye. And sometimes, people who wandered into that part of the forest on the wrong day, when the fog was just right, simply didn't come back. Reacher, the pragmatist, felt a tremor of unease. He cross-referenced the dates of historical disappearances mentioned in the diaries with the dates Ben and Leo went missing. His blood ran cold. They all fell within the same 2-day window, separated by years, decades, and even centuries. It was an anniversary of some kind. He returned to his makeshift office in the sheriff's station, his mind racing. He pulled out topographical maps of Mount Cinder, historical surveys, and astronomical charts for the region. He found the original plot of land registered to Silas Kane. With trembling hands, he drew a line from the location of the old windmill's foundation, which was marked on an 18th-century survey map. He calculated the precise angle of the sunrise on the days of the disappearances. Then he drew a long, straight line across the map of Mount Cinder, the path the windmill's shadow would have cast at the exact moment of dawn. The line passed directly over the campsite where Ben Carter had vanished. It sliced through the exact spot on the ridge where Maya had last seen Leo Martinez. Reacher stared at the line, a cold, precise scar across the rugged terrain of the map. It was impossible. It was a pattern born of folklore and superstition. And yet, it was terrifyingly consistent. He checked the weather archives. Every single documented disappearance, including the recent ones, had occurred during the same astronomical window and under the same meteorological conditions, the arrival of a sudden, thick, low-lying fog. He wasn't investigating a person anymore. He was investigating a phenomenon, an event that operated with the chilling precision of a machine. A machine whose gears were the rotation of the earth, the angle of the sun, and the coming of the fog. That night, sleep offered no escape. Reacher's dreams were a chaotic swirl of gray mist and turning blades. He saw the empty, unawakened faces of the victims, their eyes staring into nothingness. He heard the groan of ancient wood under immense strain, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. He awoke abruptly in the dark, his heart pounding against his ribs. The window of his motel room was open a crack, and the night was unnaturally silent. But beneath the silence, he could feel it, a low, rhythmic thrumming in the air. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but one he felt in his bones. He got up and walked to the window, peering out towards the dark mass of Mount Cinder. And then he saw it. For just a moment, against the backdrop of the starless, cloudy sky, a trick of the low light and the lingering mist crystallized into a shape. It was a silhouette, vast and skeletal. The unmistakable form of a great, spoked wheel, its four massive blades turning slowly, silently, in the empty air where nothing had stood for over 250 years. It was there for a heartbeat, a phantom image burned onto the night, and then it dissolved back into the darkness. Reacher stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat. The foundation of his logical world had not just cracked, it had shattered. The legend was real. The machine was still turning. And he now knew, with a certainty that terrified him more than any killer of flesh and blood, that the cycle was not over. He looked at his calendar. The astronomical window, the anniversary, would close at sunrise the next day. There was one more dawn to survive. And he knew, with a dreadful sense of purpose, that he had to be there. He had to stand on that line. The heart of the fog. There is a point where the pursuit of facts becomes an act of faith. For Alastair Reacher, that point was reached in the pre-dawn chill of the next morning. He drove his car as far up the mountain pass as the road would allow, the headlights cutting a pathetic swath through a fog that seemed to drink the light. He was armed with his service pistol, a high-powered flashlight, a GPS tracker, and a body camera, the tools of his trade. But he knew, with a sinking feeling, that they were likely as useless as trying to handcuff the wind. He left the car and began the ascent on foot. The air was heavy and cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying pine needles. The silence was absolute, a pressurized void that made the crunch of his own boots sound like a sacrilege. The fog was alive. It wasn't merely a weather condition, it was a presence. It coiled around tree trunks, slithered across the path, and clung to his clothes like a damp shroud. Sounds became distorted, a snapping twig echoed like a gunshot, while a dislodged rock would fall into the gray abyss without a whisper. He followed the GPS, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. He was heading for a spot on the line he had drawn on his map, a place equidistant from where Carter and Leo had vanished. It was an unremarkable stretch of forest, a small, moss-covered clearing on a gentle slope. As he entered the clearing, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a cold, neutral observation, the way a scientist might observe a specimen in a jar. He checked his watch. 4:50 a.m. Sunrise was less than an hour away. He stood in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle. "All right," he said aloud, his voice sounding small and thin. "I'm here. What do you want?" His only answer was the swirling of the mist. He activated his body camera, the small red light a tiny beacon of order in a world descending into chaos. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the tree line. The light seemed to struggle, penetrating only a few feet before being diffused and swallowed by the fog. Then, the thrumming started. It was the same subsonic vibration he had felt from his motel room, but here, at the epicenter, it was infinitely more powerful. It resonated through the soles of his boots, up his spine, and into the base of his skull. It was the feeling of immense, ancient machinery groaning to life somewhere beyond the veil of sight. With the thrumming came a sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of old, stressed wood. Creak. Grun. Creak. Grun. It was the sound of Silas Kane's windmill turning its ghostly blades. Reacher drew his pistol, the cold steel a small comfort in his hand. He held the flashlight forward, his knuckles white. The fog ahead of him began to coalesce, to thicken and darken. It was no longer just mist, it was taking on form, structure. Slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the silhouette began to appear. It was vast, far larger than he had imagined. The spectral frame of the windmill stood before him, a ghostly architecture of impossible angles against the gray fog. And at its center, the great wheel turned, each of its four massive blades sweeping through the air with a soundless, inexorable power. It was a hole in the world, a phantom of wood and gears driven by a force that defied physics. As the blades turned, the air grew colder, and Reacher saw them. Figures began to appear within the fog, standing motionlessly at the edge of the clearing. They were translucent, their forms wavering like heat haze. He saw Ben Carter, his head cocked to the side, a look of placid curiosity on his face. He saw Leo Martinez, his eyes open but utterly vacant, staring towards the turning wheel. And he saw others, a dozen or more figures stretching back through time. A woman in pioneer dress, a man in the worn clothes of a 19th-century prospector, a young boy clutching a wooden toy. All of them silent. All of them with the same unawakened stare, their attention captured by the phantom machine. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, they were recordings, echoes trapped in a loop, replaying their final moments for an audience of none. Reacher's heart hammered against his ribs. His scientific mind screamed that this was a hallucination, a product of infrasound and atmospheric pressure playing tricks on his senses. But the cold, the sight of the victims, the sheer presence of the thing in front of him, was too real to deny. He raised his flashlight beam to the center of the turning wheel, to the axis where the blades met. There, the darkness was deepest. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a vortex, a swirling nexus of absolute blackness that seemed to be the source of the thrumming. It was the heart of the phenomenon, the curse, the entity. The shadow of the windmill. He felt a pull. A gentle but insistent tug on his consciousness, a siren song that whispered of peace, of an end to struggle, of simply letting go and joining the silent, staring audience. The thought was seductive. Just turn your head, it seemed to say. Just look. Just be still. He saw his own hand begin to lower the flashlight. He felt his head begin to turn, his muscles responding to a will that was not his own. The faces of Carter and Leo swam in his vision, their blankness an invitation. With a surge of primal adrenaline, Reacher fought back. He yelled, a raw, guttural sound of defiance that tore through the silence. No. He forced his head to face forward, his gaze fixed on the vortex. He raised his pistol and fired. The shot was deafening in the clearing, the muzzle flash a brief, violent star. The bullet passed through the spectral image without effect, hitting a tree somewhere in the unseen distance. The machine did not even register his protest. The pull intensified. The world at the periphery of his vision began to gray out, his focus narrowing to the turning blades and the silent figures. He was losing. The mountain was taking him. In a last, desperate act of self-preservation, he turned and ran. He didn't look at the GPS, he just scrambled away from the clearing, away from the thrumming, away from the creaking wheel. He crashed through underbrush, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. He could feel the cold presence at his back, the silent invitation following him. He did not look back. He knew, with absolute certainty, that if he looked back, he would be lost forever. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing onto the damp earth, gasping for the thick, misty air. When he finally dared to look up, the thrumming was gone. The creaking had ceased. The sun was beginning to rise, and its weak light was starting to burn away the edges of the fog. The clearing was gone. The machine was gone. The cycle was over. For now. Reacher stumbled back to his car, a man hollowed out. His body camera was dead, the footage corrupted into a file of screeching static. His GPS tracker had logged his movements into the forest and then, for a period of 7 minutes, showed him as stationary before he sprinted out. He had no proof. He had only a story that no one would ever believe and the chilling memory of the unawakened faces in the mist. He was a man of facts who had collided with an impossible truth. As he drove away from Mount Cinder, he looked in his rearview mirror. The peak was now clear, majestic in the morning sun, looking as peaceful and inert as any other mountain. But Reacher knew what it was. It wasn't just rock and earth. It was a machine. It was a tomb. And it was waiting. What do you think is happening on Mount Cinder? Is it the curse of an ancient miller, a bizarre natural phenomenon that traps human consciousness, or something else entirely, something from beyond our understanding? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below.